the lecture on modern era foreign policy from 1970s to the present, and we'll start with a quick little quiz. You can see background photo is the American Eagle being chased and nagged by many different problems, as this era has produced a lot of different challenges for us internationally. I'm going to show you the picture of a president. You can pause this if you want to play, and you can submit this as extra credit quiz. It won't be for a lot of points, but if you want to give it a try, I'll show you the picture of a president. You write down, you can pause it, write down who you think it is and the term they served and whether they're Democrat or Republican, and then I will click and reveal the answer. Here we go. Pause it. There you go. Alright, that is Richard Nixon, president elected in 68 and 72 and then resigned in 74. He's a Republican. Next one's a little harder. That's Gerald Ford, served for 2 years and then lost the election in 1976 to this man. That's Jimmy Carter, Democrat, served 1 term, lost in 1980 to this man. That, of course, is Ronald Reagan, served 2 terms, one of our most popular recent presidents, Republican. He was followed by that man, who is George H.W. Bush, the father of George W. Bush. He was his vice president, so that was 3 Republican terms in a row. Followed by this man everybody knows. Bill Clinton served 2 terms, a Democrat, first Democrat since Carter. He was followed by this man. George W. Bush, Republican, served 2 terms, one of the rare father-son combos as president. And he was followed by that man. Of course, Barack Obama still serving as president, Democrat. There are 5 big events or trends that in the modern era. The first one is the question internationally of when do we get involved? When do we intervene? In the 50s and 60s, of course, that question was easy. After World War II, the lesson was get involved everywhere. But the lesson from the Vietnam War was, well, maybe we should be more cautious, and we wanted to avoid what was known as a quagmire, a war where we get bogged down. The Cold War continued, but unlike the 50s and 60s when it was so hard, it changed, lessened a little bit, and then we won it. It ended in 1989. After the Cold War, there was initially great optimism that we would enter a new kind of peaceful era, but that proved untrue, and in some ways the post-Cold War reality of instability and unpredictability was worse. The Middle East was a chronic crisis for every president in this era, and 9/11 is the major event since the 70s in foreign policy and in American history, and led to focus on terrorism and possibility of kind of endless war in multiple areas in the world. So those are the 5 major events or trends. We'll probably split this lecture up into 2, 70s, 80s, and then I'll do another one later in the week on more recent 20 years. Those are the years that Nixon and his successor Ford served as president. The big Cold War event in Nixon's presidency was détente, and it's important to remember who Nixon was. He was the hard-charging red hunter of HUAC, who became the attack dog for Eisenhower in the 50s as vice president. But as president, he led détente, which was an easing of hostilities or a warming of relations with the Soviet Union and our other Cold War foe, China. And because of his hawkish credentials, he was probably more able to pull that off and have people believe that he wasn't soft and that it was a good idea. Just like when a battle veteran general says he wants to negotiate a peace treaty, people are more likely to believe him than somebody who was never at war. What détente was an opening up of relations with China and the Soviet Union. And it's definitely Nixon's huge achievement as president. In 1972, he was the first president to travel to China and followed that up with a meeting in Moscow, the first American president since Roosevelt to go to Soviet Union, first president ever to visit Moscow, and he followed that with a couple of nuclear arms treaties that I'll talk about on the next slide. In the Middle East, Nixon and Ford dealt with a number of wars between the Arab states and Israel. In 1967, there is the Six-Day War. 1973, there's the Yom Kippur War. Egypt, Syria, Jordan all attack Israel, and Israel comes out of it doing pretty well and actually gaining territory. That's the occupied territory. Sometimes you hear about the Golan Heights or the West Bank or the Sinai Peninsula. All of those territories were taken by Israel during the war. They gave back the Sinai Peninsula, but have kept the other occupied territories, and that is what, through many decades, they've continued to negotiate with the PLO and others about, and it leads to tensions today. The other big event is the rise of the oil-producing nations. OPEC is the oil cartel. It stands for Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. We'll talk about more about that when we talk about the U.S. economy and the oil price increases of the 70s. You should know some stuff about nuclear arms and the nuclear arms race. The first is what is even a ballistic missile? That is a missile that flies in an arc where it's launched with a rocket, and then the rest of it is just kind of using gravity to fly, as opposed to a cruise missile that flies near the ground and has to be propelled throughout its whole flight. Missile defense were missiles used in an anti-ballistic fashion to kind of, so that missile is coming in, and anti-ballistic missile would be used to, let's use blue, shoot it down before it reaches its target. Anti-ballistic missiles, or missile defense in general, was considered, like missile defense, you would think it would be something that would be good, but it was considered somewhat dangerous because of the doctrine of MAD, mutually assured destruction, and people were so scared of nuclear annihilation that they thought that actually protected us. They worried that if one side thought they could defend against a nuclear attack, they might actually launch nuclear weapons. So missile defense was always a tricky subject. ICBM stands for Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, and that is those missiles that could be shot from one continent, say North America, over to Europe or Africa or Asia or something like that. And on them, each missile, you would have nuclear warheads. In the 60s, they developed a technology to put more than one warhead on each missile. So the warhead would be launched, and let's do that one in yellow, let's say. And then at some point in its trajectory, as it was nearing its location, multiple warheads could be released off of it. That's what a MIRV is. Multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles. That just means on one missile you can have multiple warheads. The nuclear triad is that we can launch nuclear missiles from the ocean, off submarines, from the land, off nuclear missile silos, or from the air. We keep a fleet of B-52s in the air that can launch nuclear missiles as well. And it means that if any one leg of the triad goes down, the others are still posing a threat. They're protecting us. What Nixon did is he negotiated two treaties. The ABM Treaty, which limited the defense missiles that we could produce on each side to just 2 sites, protecting each capital, and one other site, and they were limited to 200. And then he signed the SALT I Treaty, Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, which put those other limits on ICBMs, warheads, nuclear subs, etc. A significant achievement. In 1979, Carter negotiated the SALT II Treaty. We never ratified it because in 1980 the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, but we did observe the limits in the treaty anyway. So those are kind of the beginning of the end of the arms race. The arms race continues, but in the 80s we're going to negotiate actual arms reduction treaties, and in the 90s the Cold War will end and we will significantly reduce arms stockpiles. I'm not going to say anything about the Ford presidency, at least in terms of foreign policy. We'll focus on his domestic stuff. He was followed by Carter. And Carter tries to focus on human rights. So I've talked a lot about how America focused on fighting communism, and in that fight we often allied ourselves with pretty nasty dictators and did some nasty things as long as they were anti-communist. Carter, post-Vietnam, tries to redirect us towards focusing on improving human rights around the world, and that's tough to do because sometimes you really need to deal with a country because it's got oil or because it's strategically important, even if they're not great on human rights, and so he struggles with that. His bigger trouble is he's seen as kind of weak and dovish, and that plagues his presidency. He has one huge foreign policy achievement and one huge foreign policy failure. In 1978, he brings the president of Egypt, that is him here on the left, Anwar Sadat, and the prime minister of Israel, Menachem Begin, to Camp David outside of Washington, D.C., and bullies and coaxes and encourages them to sign a peace treaty. It's the first peace treaty between Israel and an Arab country, and it is the basis for peace today. Egypt and Israel don't really like each other, but they have a peace agreement and they've abided by it, and they're not really the issue anymore. What the U.S. promised as part of that was to sell massive amounts of arms to each country. That was how we kind of bought their cooperation. Israel every year is our largest recipient of military weaponry. We sell it to them, and Egypt is number 2 for many years. That achievement was overshadowed a little bit by the Iranian hostage crisis. There's another picture of them celebrating. By the way, Anwar Sadat was assassinated not long after that agreement because of somebody who was so upset by it. The Iranian hostage crisis is one of the low points in American history. In 1979, November, militant students took over the American embassy in Tehran, Iran. They were angry that we had supported the Shah of Iran, and in fact we had helped him stage a coup in the 50s to take power, and he finally was driven from power, and then later the American embassy was taken over. For over a year, into January of 1981, 56 American diplomats were taken hostage. There was one failed rescue attempt, and the release of the hostages was negotiated to wait until Carter left the presidency and on Reagan's inauguration. The effect was kind of piggybacking on top of our loss in Vietnam. There's this strong feeling of American weakness and incompetence. And by the end of the 70s, America was seen as a nation in decline, and our better days and our dominance over the world was ending. Reagan is going to change that. And there's Cowboy Ron, Ronald Reagan, president for most of the 80s. He reheats the Cold War and ends détente. Presides over a huge increase in military spending. Starts something called SDI, or the Strategic Defense Initiative, and more popularly known as Star Wars. He is the author of the Reagan Doctrine, which is kind of a break in containment. No longer are we going to try and just contain communism, but like Walmart rolling back prices, we are going to roll back communism in the third world. And, excuse me, getting tired. What the Reagan Doctrine said was we would give overt and covert aid, so open and secret aid, to rebels and regimes trying to end communism or topple communist regimes in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. But aside from those kind of very macho and hawkish things, Reagan also presided over the START Treaty, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, so not SALT, but START, actually reducing nuclear weapons, which was significant. And less positively, he was part of the Iran-Contra scandal. These are the Rambo years, for those of you familiar with those movies. Those movies came out in the 80s, and it's kind of being tired for feeling bad about Vietnam and the Carter years, and a renewed macho-ness in American foreign policy. This is a great slide. You should pay close attention to this one. So if you'll notice, oops, sorry, where am I? Here we are. Let's go with black. You have a huge spike in spending here in the early 50s, and that is due to what? Of course, the Korean War. And then you have another increase in the 60s, although not as much, if you notice. We never even reached the level of the Korean War, and that's during the Vietnam War. And then it declines in the 70s. And then an even bigger buildup, no real war, we just spent more on military weaponry in the 80s. So the Reagan years, just a huge increase in military spending. That is going to be matched after 9/11 with just military spending in general, and then even increased spending on the two wars we were in. So 50s, 60s, 80s, and the 2000s spike in military spending. SDI was called the Strategic Defense Initiative, and that was the attempt to develop space-based weapons to give us kind of a nuclear shield. So I talked earlier in the lecture about anti-ballistic missile defense. This was, we were going to have satellites shooting at missiles and lasers, and we spent billions of dollars on these things, and it never actually worked practically. But I would say there was some effect that it started an arms race and a military spending bonanza that Gorbachev and the Soviet Union tried to keep up with and could not. And so Reagan should get a fair amount of credit for kind of pushing the Soviets into their period when they fell apart. I think they probably would have happened anyway, and it might have happened just as soon, but Reagan's kind of hawkish military spending definitely made things more difficult for Gorbachev and hastened the end of the Soviet Union and the Cold War. More negative outcome of Reagan's hawkishness is Iran-Contra. In his second term, the Reagan administration sold about 1,500 missiles to Iran in exchange for help with the hostage release. Different hostages, not the ones in the hostage crisis. These were 7 hostages in Iran, or in Lebanon. Iran paid $30 million. $80 million of that was diverted to fund communist rebels, anti-communist rebels called Contras in Nicaragua. Both things were illegal. The Reagan administration said that it did not negotiate with terrorists or for hostages, and they lied about that. And they also were prevented from dealing with Iran because of our difficulties with that regime and the things they'd done in the past. Congress had specifically told Reagan that he could not fund the Contra rebels in Nicaragua because they were associated with atrocities and death squads killing whole villages for their support for the Sandinista government. This became known that he was doing this, and a major scandal, and consumed about a year of Reagan's presidency. It's interesting to note, we'll talk about this in class, the 3 scandals: the Watergate scandal of the 70s, the Iran-Contra scandal of the 80s, and the Lewinsky scandal of the 90s. One of them resulted in a resigned president, Nixon. One resulted in a president who escaped punishment entirely, the Iran-Contra affair and Reagan, and one resulted in impeachment, although Clinton was not in the impeachment trial. He was acquitted and didn't leave office. This is by far the most serious of the three actions. Reagan, it was never clear what he knew, although he did admit that he knew about the sale of the missiles to Iran and had directed his foreign policy team to do that. And he did tell his administration to support the Contras in any way they could. What was never proven was that he knew that the funds from the missile sale were diverted to the Contras, but separately he knew about each individual thing. And I think it was, if you're going to make Nixon resign for what he did or impeach Clinton for what he did, I think this was a far worse offense. That leads to the 90s and the Bush-Clinton years, and we will stop the lecture here, and you can get the second part of it on another day. See you guys in class.